Hi there. Welcome to our wonderful Genesis project sponsored by the OC Federation Stories from the Beginning. Here we have with us Rabbi Sarah DePaolo. She is one of the rabbis at Shir-Ha-Ma'alot. We have Rabbi Steve Einstein. He's the Rabbi Emeritus at Congregation B'nai Tzedek. And I am Rabbi Myers of Temple Beth David. We're so glad to welcome you as we have our podcast to explore these wonderful Torah portions of the week. This week, our Torah portion is Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah. What I thought that we might start off with is just sharing a little bit of what we know about Sarah. What is it that we like about her? What are the qualities that we have? Especially since we're going to say goodbye to her very quickly at the very beginning of this Torah portion, because she passes away within a couple of verses at the ripe age of 127 years of age. So we'll start with either of you. Who wants to start?
I always feel connected to Sarah because she's my namesake. So even though her story is complicated, she's a complicated person. I don't always agree with all of the things that she does or the way that she handles situations. In Genesis, I still feel very connected to her. And I think that's something that I notice with my students as well. When they find a biblical character who's their namesake, they're suddenly connected to the story in a very personal way.
So we've been looking at Abraham for a while. Sarah is an important part of that story. And Abraham is the founder of our people and a great hero when we think of Abraham at arguing with God at Sodom and Gomorrah. However, when it comes to his own son Isaac, he's silent. And this is a very troublesome story. And it's very interesting. The Bible is only the beginning. That Judaism is much, much more. And we read the Torah often through the eyes of Midrash, and that's kind of reading between the lines. And some people may be familiar with a relatively modern Midrash that answers the question, where was Sarah when all this was going on? Her one son was going to be murdered by her fanatical husband. And what does she do about it? The text is silent, but the Midrash is not. Now, you know the end of that story, right? We read it every year on Rosh Hashanah. And at the crucial moment, Abraham looks up and he hears a voice and he sees a ram caught in the bush. That's the day. How did that ram get there? According to the modern Midrash, Sarah was coming up the other side of the mountain, leading the ram. She becomes, in the Midrash, the heroine of the story. It's not in the text, but what? There's so much that is not in the text that becomes real for us, such as what did Abraham's father do for a living? And every first grader will tell you he was an idol maker. That's not in the text either. So anyway, those are a few starting thoughts about Sarah, who, as our Rabbi Sarah has pointed out, our mother Sarah is a bit of a complicated character, and this paints her in a really positive light, I think.
Well, and you don't even have to go into Midrash to see all these wonderful qualities that Sarah has. She's a woman who struggles to have a child. The very beginning, even before the Torah portion Lech Lecha, we're told that her name at that point is Sarai and that she's barren. She's willing to go forth with her husband to a whole new land. They are such partners. She's willing to say that she is his sister to protect him, from Pharaoh of Egypt and also King Abimelech of Gerar, to protect him, even at potential risk to herself. She is side by side with him, welcoming those three strangers, those divine messengers in the heat of the day, and finally has a child. And we do see the humanity of her and the complexity of her when she's jealous with her son playing with her handmaid son. But you're right, Rabbi Einstein, the rabbis will connect the binding of Isaac, Abraham's almost sacrifice of his son Isaac, that when Sarah then learns of it, that she expires. But when you look at the text in itself, she's 127 years old. She's not a spring chicken. And even after Abraham, procures the burial spot for her, the Torah tells us that he's old. So I wanted for you to share right now a bit, what do you love about the story of Chayei Sarah? Because Sarah is, passes away in the initial verses. So why is this Torah portion called Chayei Sarah? Why do you even like this Torah portion? So, yeah, go ahead.
I love this Torah portion, and I love the way that it's arranged, actually. So we start with the beginning of the story, and Sarah dies, and she's buried. And at the very end of the portion, she gets welcomed back in. She's sort of the bookends of this portion, because at the very end of the story, we learn that Abraham's servant has gone and found a partner for Isaac. Her name is Rebecca, and she seems to exude some of the qualities that Sarah had, and
like what? Like what? It's great.
Well, I read something interesting that actually Rebecca is Abraham's spiritual heir more than Sarah, and I was really sort of intrigued by that. But anyway, just to finish the thought that I had before, which was that Isaac welcomes Rebecca into his mother's tent, and he is comforted after her death. That is sort of the bookends of this portion in some way.
Isn't that sort of beautiful just to take that in? Yeah. So, by the way, Sarah was clearly loved. She was loved by her husband. He's mourning, and he goes through great lengths to procure that burial spot in the cave Machpelah. And you see the impact on Isaac, because the Torah goes out of its way to say that when he sees Rebecca, he takes her into his tent. That is, she becomes his wife. And it says that he loved her, and he found comfort after the death of his mother, which is just the Torah. Go ahead.
Yeah, of course. That piece is very interesting at the very end of the portion, the order that it gives. He marries her. He loves her.
Yes.
The opposite of the way things tend to go today. And I'm not arguing for going back to the quote, good old days, but there's something about it. And we know that that first blush of love, when we are so excited when we see our beloved and so on, is lovely, but that does not carry you through the long haul. There has to be something more. It's interesting, going back to the beginning of the portion and tying in with what you said, Rabbi Myers, about finding the burial place. So it starts out by saying, this is the life of Sarah. It says how long she lived, and she died. I happen to love cemeteries, which that's a good thing, because as rabbis, we're often at cemeteries. The old cemeteries, of course, have a lot of history. And even our local Orange County cemeteries, I go through there and see many people who were friends over the years who are now there. And so I feel a real connection. But it's interesting when you look at the markers, typically it will have somebody's name, and it will have the years, very similar to how this portion starts. It just says, oh, you lived so many years. And then there's a dash in between the birth year and the death year. And of course, it is what happens during that dash that really makes up the life of a person. And that rarely do we see. I mean, yeah, they'll put the usual stuff, beloved, father, mother, son, all that stuff, which is lovely. But you don't really get a picture of the person. The real picture is what we're doing during this dash. One last thing I want to say right now about cemeteries. I'm talking with a friend this week who had just come back from El Paso. She had never been to El Paso. And she said a friend of hers was taking her around town and showed her, oh, this is where the Jewish cemetery is. And my friend said, I didn't realize there was such an established Jewish community in El Paso to have a Jewish cemetery. And I pointed out that that's the first thing we do. When more than one Jew arrives, the first thing we better start thinking about is we're all mortal. Even if it's after the 120 years, at a certain point, we're going to need consecrated ground. I think it's one of the reasons that I I love a cemetery. I don't wear a kippah all the time, but when I go into sacred space, I'm careful to do so. And when I go to a Jewish cemetery, I'm always mindful of that and put my kippah on.
Rabbi Einstein, I wanted to get back to a point you made at the beginning, that you said that the order that, that Isaac and Rebecca are married first, and the Torah says that they loved each other, and the importance of having common traits or commonality for an enduring marriage. So what are the traits or qualities you think that Rebecca had that really worked for their marriage, or perhaps, reminded Isaac of his mother, of his family values? What would you guys say were the values or the things that Rebecca and Isaac had in common that made their marriage work? Either of you can answer if you want.
Well, I'll say one thing. First of all, that's described when the servant, who again tradition says was named Eliezer, the text doesn't actually say that, went to look for a wife for his master's son, went back to what we call the old country. Was looking for one particular quality, really, and that was kindness. And that was the exact quality that Rebecca showed. She watered the flocks, etc., etc. And kindness is something that I can really relate to. I think that's very important. My mother used to say something, my mother of blessed memory. I don't know if she was right, but I have always felt it to be so. And that is, when you look at a person, you can see the kindness on a person's face if they have kindness. The other thing that struck me, Rabbi Mike, when you were asking about the two women in Isaac's life, his mother and his wife, they were both like many Jewish women I know. And that was, in many ways, they were in the driver's seat. And you'll remember, even when Sarah said something that Abraham was not quite sure about, God said, listen to your wife, right? And both of them were basically domestic engineers. They engineered what would happen in their household to the extent that any wife or mother can do so. But excellent. I think that we're both, in that sense, positive, strong role models.
Absolutely. Rabbi DePaolo.
Well, what I appreciate about all of this is the activity of Rebecca and Sarah, as well as actors in their own lives, as people who have verbs attached to them. So often in biblical text, women are sort of absent from the story. They don't have verbs attached to their lives. And these stories in Genesis in particular give us fleshed out people, fleshed out women, fleshed out men to think about, who are challenging and complicated and also acting in their own lives. And Rebecca in particular really embodies that. When we get introduced to her, the Torah tells us that she rushes to bring water to Abraham's servant, and she runs home to tell her family what's gone on. And a number of rabbis notice that those verbs really match actually Abraham when he's sitting at his tent and he gets approached by the three strangers who are going to tell him that Isaac will be born in the next year. That Abraham rushes to welcome them and runs to get food ready, and that Abraham, we are told, our tradition is told, he embodies chesed, kindness, like Rabbi Einstein said, and that Rebecca is now carrying those values, and perhaps that's partly what Isaac sees in her and why he loves her, that she embodies the values that his family demonstrated all his life.
So beautiful. I mean, it's a paradox in a way that the Torah portion is called Chayei Sarah. It begins with her death, but her life is continuing on through her son, finding love again, and the continuity of their family, Lador Vador, from generation to generation. But the Torah portion doesn't end with that. It's rather fascinating. Isaac is finally taken care of. Just to backtrack for a moment, when Sarah dies, the Torah tells us that Abraham is old. He finally feels the weight of his years. But somehow, when Isaac finds love, then Abraham's ready to live again for himself. So any comments you want to make that Abraham remarries? He remarries and he has more children. So, it's almost like this incredible epilogue to Abraham's life. So I don't know if you any of that resonates for you, or if you would like to speak about that, about Abraham continuing on.
Well, the thing that hit me in reviewing the portion was that the end of the portion does talk about the marriage that Abraham had. And if you ask most people who was Abraham's wife, they'll say Sarah. They may know about the story with Hagar, who was like what we might call a Class B wife. But then he does remarry. As a widower, he remarries a woman called Keturah. Who knows about her? And her 12 sons and the grandchildren. And then you get to the end of it. There's so much here. I always learn, don't speak against the text, but there are parts of the text that certainly reflect their age that is different from our age, and think about that period that we're glad we're in a more progressive time, shall we say. And that is all of these children and grandchildren of Abraham, but his real estate, shall we say, his property goes to his son. And that is, and son, he had, didn't he? It went, well, if we're reading the Torah, it went to his beloved son, Isaac, the son of his beloved wife, Sarah. If you're reading the Quran, of course, the story of our cousins, it goes a different way, where that leadership goes. Okay, it's fascinating. But also, one other piece going back that is a little disturbing, and that is Rebecca a little bit of a say as to whether she marries Isaac. A little bit of a say. Basically, this was a deal that was made between the party of the first part, Eliezer representing his master Abraham, and the party of the second part being the father and brother of Rebecca. They work out the terms, including the financial terms, which were quite major. We're talking about substantial wealth that these people all had. And then it said, yeah, she was allowed to say, does she agree to this? And that was about it. So I don't think any of us would trade places with that era when it comes to this subject.
That's definitely fair. But I think you can also read those settings with a little more action and give and see a little more agency in Rebecca's actions and how she interacts, right? So she does the initial negotiating with Abraham's servant. She's the one who speaks to him. She offers to bring water for his camels, and when he offers her this gold, a nose ring, and bracelets, she accepts them, right? And that happens without her family present at all. And you can also take a look at her response when her family agrees to the terms. They say, well, wait a couple of days, she's not ready to go yet. And Abraham's servant asks her, and she responds, I will go, Elech. And so she sort of like mirrors again Abraham's response to Lech Lecha, go for yourself, that you can read a little more agency into her actions. But that's sort of the beauty of reading our text over and over and over again, right? That we can see things through a different lens every single time, and we can see a world that doesn't have room for women's voices and doesn't give them power to talk about their lives and to think about what they want for them, or we can think about we can imagine more power in this person's life.
It is astounding that they ask her anything. I mean, I know we went back a little bit to Eliezer Rebecca bringing Eliezer back to her family and wanting to bring Rebecca back to Israel to marry his master's son Isaac. And he brought a lot of wealth with him, these 10 camels laden with all these goods. And they're like, yeah, sure. It's part of our family system. I mean, she's I think the great niece of Abraham. So it made sense. But the fact that the servant wanted to get going immediately, and they ask her, do you want to go? And it's astounding they even do that, in a very patriarchal society. But she says yes. She does not waver. And then when she finally gets back to Israel, and what does the Torah say when she first sees this man wandering in the fields? She falls off her camel. It's like someone, when you see someone who's like, and you stumble, it's like, who is that guy? And they probably were around this same age, because Abraham and Sarah had Isaac in their older years. So I mean, it's a great love story.
Sure. There's another thing that hits me completely different from what we've been talking about, and that is how our Jewish practices are often tied to passages in our early scriptures. Rabbi Myers, you just spoke about that moment when these two young people see each other. Well, what was Isaac doing? It says he was out in the field toward evening meditating. And, our rabbis say that the three statutory prayers of Mincha in the afternoon, Ma'ariv in the evening, Shacharit in the morning, are tied to three verses of our patriarchs when they were out doing something that they could read as, quote, davening. And the other thing is the tradition of Bedekin, when the bride at a wedding is, the veil is placed upon her, there are traditional words of blessing that are said to her, and they are the exact words that were spoken to Rebecca as she was about to leave. Oh, sister, may you become the mother of thousands and myriads, and so on. And these are still the same words that are traditionally said today. This ties us back to history, going back thousands of years. And as we see practices that are going on in different parts of the world, we're tied to people everywhere around the world too.
Rabbi DePaolo, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, I'm still thinking about your question, Rabbi Myers, about the end of the portion where we meet Abraham's new wife, Keturah, and her family and the children that come afterwards. And thinking about that idea and what that means, that when a parent, Abraham is maybe able to focus on his life again, knowing that Isaac is cared for, that he has a partner, and that he can imagine he's sort of renewed with strength enough to have another family. And then at the very end, though, the text turns and says, what's the most important thing? What's the note that we're going to end on, though, which is Abraham's death. And Isaac and Ishmael come together to bury their father in the cave of Machpelah. That these half-brothers who, at the beginning of their story, are sort of held apart and been told that, Hagar and Ishmael have been sent away as a result of Sarah's request, and yet they come back together, and we're sort of imagining, are they able to heal their relationship? Are they able to bring some sort of meaning to their lives and the end of their father's life by burying him together? That there's a very human element to all of these stories. They look and sound like the families we know in our world, where people have step-siblings and half-siblings, and they have step-parents, and it's complicated, but you can find love and meaning in those relationships as well.
That's a fitting conclusion about Abraham in this new stage of life, being able to continue to still live fully. Once he knew that his son was taken care of, the children and family as through Keturah, but then when he passes at 175 years of age, his two sons, who used to be estranged from each other, we don't know when they reconciled or when they came together, but Isaac and Ishmael come together to bury their father together in the cave of Machpelah. So it's a powerful ending, when you've had strife from previous years, that a family can come together, at these important times, and remembering their ancestor, remembering their loves, and still connecting as a family. So I want to thank all of you, Rabbi Sarah DePaolo, Rabbi Stephen Einstein, for joining us here for our discussion on Chayei Sarah. And for those of you who have been watching this video, we hope you'll be inspired to read the text itself. Thank you so much.